Thank you for taking the time once again to join me, Dan Lizette, here on the Podcast Digest. Folks, this is episode 23. I truly hope you've been enjoying the show, especially the most recent episodes where I've been joined by some of the hosts of my absolute favorite shows, and there's no exception with today's guest. But first, I want to remind you that if you missed any of the previous episodes, you can find them all, along with additional exclusive blog entries at thepodcastdigest.info. If you're not already, you can connect with me and the show on Twitter at PodDigest, and of course on Facebook, facebook.com/thepodcastdigest. Question, comments, and requests can also be emailed, thepodcastdigest@gmail.com. And last but not least, I do have a huge favor to ask of you. If you do like the show, what I'm doing, would you please leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher? It literally takes 90 seconds and will help the show more than you can realize. It's literally the best way for new listeners to find the show and come aboard. This week, I have a very special guest. In fact, this will be the first time I've had the opportunity to speak to a host that I've been listening to long before I ever thought of having my own podcast. Literally years now, I've been listening to this gentleman. He's been podcasting for more than 11 years, one of the originals with a focus in one of my favorite fields, technology. Currently, he's a host of TechFan and OWC Radio and the owner of mymac.com. I'm very pleased to welcome Tim Robertson to the Podcast Digest. How you doing, Tim?
Good. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
I certainly appreciate you taking the time to join us here as well. As I mentioned to you beforehand, I've been a huge fan, especially of TechFan over the years. And folks, if you have not listened to the TechFan or OWC Radio or several of the other shows we're going to talk about, and you are interested in technology, these are a couple subscriptions you need to add. Before we get into the shows, though, Tim, can you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background?
Sure. I got into technology in 93, 94 when my now ex-wife, I'm since remarried happily for many years, but my first wife and I got pregnant, and I thought she's going to need to know how to use computers probably more than I'll ever need to know. I wasn't into computers at all. I was kind of a jock, listen to heavy metal. That's the kind of guy I was. So I thought, I'm going to buy a computer, so when she's born, she's going to grow up with this technology in the house. She's not going to be scared of it the way I was. And that's what I did. That's how I got into technology. I took to it very intuitively. I just kind of understood it. I don't know why. And people started coming to me with questions. And that led me to developing the original My Mac magazine back in 1995, which was just a way that people could learn more about programs they could use on their Mac. I got into the Mac because that's the computer I bought. I liked it a lot. It seemed easier, and that was important to me at the time, being a computer newbie, to get a Mac rather than a PC. It seemed easier, and that's kind of how I got into it.
And podcasting didn't come too far there long after, I guess. Another 10, 11 years ago, you jumped into the podcasting game. Tell us a little bit about your history in the podcasting world.
Well, the first podcast I ever listened to, and probably a lot of people are with me, was the Daily Source Code from Adam Curry. I love this idea of podcasting. Now, I actually had a similar idea, and I still have the audio file for this as well. In 1999, I had this idea that with the popularity of MP3s, what if I had a conversation with somebody over the phone? We could record it, and we could put it up at mymac.com, and people could listen to it on their computer. Remember, there wasn't an iPod or anything like that at the time, but MP3s were huge. This was, at the time of Napster and all that. So we could record like a 15-minute conversation. It'd be less than 10 megabytes. And so I recorded an episode. It had intro music. It had me talking into a mic. And I uploaded it to the entire staff of MyMac saying, this is kind of what I'd like to do. But remember, this is 1999. Bandwidth was super expensive. Hosting fees were astronomical. Even though I owned my own server, it was just going to be too expensive. So I kind of shelved the idea. Then I heard the Daily Source Code in 2004, and I thought, this is exactly what I want to be doing. It took 5 years for the technology and the economics to make it worthwhile to do, so I wouldn't break the bank by uploading these huge files. And I reached out to Adam Curry, who was the guy who did the podcast, the Daily Source Code. And I said, I really want to do this. I can't get this RSS thing working right. So he actually helped me write my first RSS feed, and the rest is history. We started the MyMac podcast. And, the funny thing is, I didn't mean to do the podcast myself. I thought I would get it started. And someone with more talent and a better on the microphone than I was would take it over. But I kind of fell in love with it.
I think that's happened to a lot of us, really.
Well, I wanted to be a radio guy growing up in high school, and then I found out how much radio guys make, and I went, no, I don't want to do that.
It's very funny you say that. I had a very similar experience growing up. Growing up, what I used to do was actually watch football games, and I had a little boombox type thing with a record button for a blank tape, and I would sort of do the announcing over the football games. And
you were calling the plays.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had stacks of these things all growing up from, say, 10 to 15. I was doing this. And then as, you know, the guidance counselors in high school hit you with the what you want to be with you grow up, started to find out that getting into sports broadcasting was very difficult and would have been something that, you know, you could get stuck in a small college town making, you know, 10 grand a year or something. And I said, you know, I'm going to switch things up. And but like you, I never lost that love for the microphone. So actually, I started mobile DJing, which I did until about 5 months ago when I started this podcast. So,
well, you've got a great voice for broadcasting, much better than mine. It's deep and rich, and I think you would have been very successful as a broadcaster.
I appreciate that, Tim, and I've heard that a lot from folks. And folks, if you're one of the ones who sent me that type of feedback, thank you. It's very humbling, and I do greatly appreciate the compliments, but I think there's a lot of others that are doing it better than I am. But back to you, Tim. You talked about this long, rich history with podcasting, and I'm sure you have a ton of stories. I've listened to several podcasts about podcasts, and I believe Dave Jackson's doing the one that talks about because of my podcast, something happened. I know we talked about one particular story on Twitter. What are some of the best stories you've got from this long career in podcasting?
Oh, I could tell you there's so many. The biggest one for me, I think, is meeting so many new people. My best friend I consider now is David Cohen. He lives in the UK. We've physically been in the same area 3 times at a Macworld Expo over the years. That's it. That's the only time I've ever seen him in person, but he's my best friend at this point. We've been podcasting together for 7-8 years. Either on OWC, or I'm sorry, either on TechFan or the MyMac podcast originally. And, you know, meeting so many new people because of podcasting and what it's led me to career-wise, I could never have anticipated when I started podcasting. But my first story, when it comes to the kind of the power and the allure of it, my original co-host was Chad Perry. And I used to walk over to his house. He only lives like 4 blocks away. I would walk over to his house. We'd record the episode. I would come back to my house. I would edit it. I'd get it uploaded. And we were within the first month of podcasting, 2 months. And I get this email from a listener in the UK who was listening to the show in the tube, in the subway. And I thought it was amazing because when I uploaded the file, it was pretty late at night. I went to bed, woke up the next morning, and here's this email. I thought it was amazing that somebody was actually listening to my conversation with Chad from the day before all the way in London while I was sleeping. And it just kind of, it blew me away that there was somebody on, you know, in another country so far away listening to it. And then I would get emails from literally all over the world. And there's just no rules, you know. Here in the U.S., we have the FCC. You can't say certain words, and you can't make certain claims, and you have all these rules that you have to follow as a radio station, and television, and the movies. But in podcasting, there are no rules. There isn't a governing body, so people can do pretty much whatever they want. And the nice thing is the quality content always rises to the top if people stick with it. And it's meeting the people that's taken the chance, that's put themselves out there, that has this passion to do it, and they're doing it. To me, that's the best story, is meeting these people that are doing it. Or at the very least, I get to enjoy the fruits of their labor. I get to listen to this thing that they're passionate about, that they create. And we've never had that before in the history of this planet, that sort of creative control on a global scale as far as distribution for pennies. It costs pennies to do it.
Exactly. And you talk about meeting people. I could tell you a little bit as a listener. We talked before we came online today that a lot of my passion in this podcasting was built on how fervent a listener I was, and that's what sort of motivated me to start this show. You mentioned David Cohen, your co-host on TechFan, and I told you I'd been listening for a long time, and when you mention interactions with listener, as a listener, one of the things that's so great about this medium I have found is that you really get to feel as if you personally know some of the hosts that you're listening to. And David Cohen, I think, for me as a listener, is one of those great examples. And I'll tell you, and I know you know this more in detail than I do, what was it, maybe 2.5 or 3 years ago, he had what I could only tell to be a horrific car accident. Yeah. And each week, he would sort of document his recovery, and you would check in with him and we'd get updates, and that just really, and of course nobody would ever wish something like that to happen to anyone, but because it was documented, so to speak, through the weekly installments of TechFan, it really made me, when it came in my feed each week, be like, I wonder how David's doing. And because I knew I'd get an update, and it like you said, somebody I'd never met but grown to become familiar with and wish the best for. And as a listener's perspective on something you've done recently, there's that perception that I think has been out there for a lot of listeners.
And, it also documents the passage of time in that we hardly even mention it anymore because it seems like it was so long ago, and it was. But as a listener, and you listen to people who kind of recount these stories and realize how long it's been, you kind of start appreciating how long you've been doing something, in this case, TechFan.
Right, and now I think David's been talking about buying new cars. The electric car conversation's been going on recently, I remember.
Yeah, I wish I could buy a electric car. It's not feasible for me, but in his situation, he's looking at buying a new house. He's going to buy an electric car. In fact, he did. He got the Leaf. Yep. It's not something that I could do, but because I get to talk to him all the time, I kind of feel like I know what it's like to own one. He tells you the things as he's talking about it that you don't read online in, reviews for electric cars. I don't know why I keep wanting to say electric guitars. You get to live vicariously through someone like that when they're doing things that you may not have any interest at all, and you find that you are interested in it because you're starting to listen to this conversation, or it's something that you don't know anything about and you start learning about it. To me, that's a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And David and you do a tremendous job on TechFan. And folks, if you are into technology at all, you can see just in the brief topics we've recounted here, they really do cover the gamut in all kinds of different areas. But back to the stories from podcasting. So many people have said they now want to hear this after our interaction on Twitter. There was a death threat that came from a podcast. I've got to hear this story.
Well, I'm going to shorten the story quite a bit because it's two different stories that blend together.
Okay.
It was pretty early in my podcasting life, late 2005, early 2006. I was doing it, like I said earlier, with Chad Perry, and this was on the MyMac show. And you got to remember, there wasn't a lot of podcasts out there at the time. So we were advertising our show on other podcasts, and we were playing other podcasters' ads on our show. So we were starting to get quite a few listeners. And at the time, I think we had around 12,000 listeners. I decided I wanted to spend a little bit more time less on the Apple and Mac stuff and a little bit more time on Chad and I, so people could learn to get to know us, if you will. Make a connection with the hosts. If they find out that they like us, they're going to like us and not just the content we talk about. We'll get even more listeners, or listeners will become more, wanting to listen more often. So the idea was, okay, Chad, you tell a story about something that you've done in the past, and I'll do the same. I don't remember what Chad's story was, to be honest with you. He's been a good friend of mine for so long. We did so many episodes together, I can't remember. But mine was a story, a very, I thought, humorous story from when I was 18 years old, 17 years old maybe. And it involved not really even accidentally, I killed a bat. A bat. It got into the store that I was a manager of, and 17-year-old kid surrounded by other 17-year-old boys, things happen. And remember, this was the 80s. So we end up killing this bat. I was a kid, and I even admitted on the show it was cruel. I shouldn't have done that. I felt bad afterwards. And but this is the story. This is actually something that happened. And most people, when I recount that whole story, they laugh about it. And they understand you were a kid. It was stupid, but it was a bat. It's not like, it was a child. So I tell this story on the podcast, and I don't think anything of it. And then I get one email from somebody. My name is so-and-so. I actually belong to a bat rescue group, and your story was the most horrific thing I've ever heard. You should be ashamed of yourself. This person then distilled the story down to 3 or 4 sentences and sent it to a bat rescue mailing list.
Oh, boy.
And the people came out of the woods with the pitchforks and the torches. I was getting 3 or 4 death threats every single day, to the point where my wife was starting to get worried and kind of started insisting that I call the police about this. But I took the opposite tactic. I actually replied to every single one of them. And instead of being defensive, even apologizing for my actions from, 20 years before, I said, well, I understand that you're passionate about, rescuing bats. I think that your threats against me is wrong. My children also probably think they're wrong. And that if you actually follow through on your threats, my children would be fatherless. How would that make you feel? And almost to a person, they would respond, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have said that. And, I took the approach of humanity, and it really worked. People were apologetic for being so mean.
Wow. That's an amazing story, Tim.
But it went on for about 6 weeks. I mean,
holy mackerel.
It was kind of scary at first. And then I knew what I was going to do to respond to people. And honestly, I think most people, I know this probably isn't the most popular or wide-held belief, but I think most people, 99.9% of the people on this planet, are good people. And they don't want to harm anybody. No matter if they have different religious or political beliefs, they don't really want to harm anybody. And I think that's true for 99.9% of the people on this planet. And when you appeal to someone on those grounds with that commonality, usually something good comes out of it.
And I think that's an important lesson to take from that. The only other lesson that I can think of is I had no idea there was a bat rescue email list.
I didn't either.
I had no idea there would be a distribution list for that, but there's apparently a distribution list for just about everything. And
I've kept every episode that I've ever done other than the first 2, which I simply cannot find. I don't know what happened to them. But that podcast is still live somewhere at mymacpodcast.com. I don't remember which episode it was. If I did a little research, I could probably find it.
Right.
But it's still live. And then, a good few weeks after that episode, I actually talk about the death threats. And I think I even read a few of them on the show.
That has to go into the halls of the greatest hits of Tim Robertson, I would think. That's
well,
amazing.
That one, and I also had an interview with Gil Amelio, who was the ex-CEO of Apple Computer. And that was probably one of my proudest moments as a podcaster. And this was before the iPhone. And I couldn't get him on Skype at all. So I literally had a little Motorola flip phone that I was holding up to the microphone as we did this interview. That was a lot of fun.
I remember you talking about that last year sometime, I believe, when you were putting together, excuse my ignorance, it was either the 10-year or the 500th episode of My Mac. You were going back and putting together the accumulated greatest hits.
Yeah, it was for the 10-year anniversary of that show. Yeah, I still own that show, but I don't actually do that show anymore. That's 2 other hosts.
Let's talk about your other shows. OWC Radio is something that you're doing right now as well. I understand you are now in the employ of Otherworld Computing. Is that correct?
Yeah, I've got a good history with the company. What happened was back in 2009, they were actually a sponsor of the MyMac podcast. And I came up with the idea that wouldn't it be cool to actually go there to their headquarters in Woodstock, Illinois, which is about a 4-hour drive from where I live, and have an interview with Larry, the owner of OWC, and his team. So I did that. Guy Searle was also co-host at the time. He's the host of the show now. He actually flew from Virginia and met me in Woodstock, Illinois. He's got way more time on his hands than I do, apparently. And so we flew in, or I drove to Woodstock, Illinois. We did the interview. I toured the whole place. It was fantastic. I really liked the company. I'd had pretty good relationships with them in the past from doing product reviews and, of course, being a sponsor of the podcast itself. And I thought, what would be cool is if they had their own podcast. So I wrote a proposal. And the proposal was basically I would do a show for them. But it wouldn't be an infomercial because nobody's going to want to listen to that. It's going to be a regular Mac show, Apple focus show, but with only one sponsor. And they agreed. So I effectively retired from the MyMac podcast and did OWC Radio. And I was very experimental on that original OWC Radio. I would I would walk down by the river with portable recording gear and record there so people could hear traffic in the background. They could hear the water flowing. Because, and that goes back to what I've always been saying, there's no rules in podcasting. There's no right way of doing things. There's really no wrong way. The only wrong way is if people send you hate mail and saying, I'm never going to listen to this again because it's so annoying. In which case, you might want to change it, but you don't have to change it if you don't want to because there's no rules here. So I was very experimental. I really enjoyed it. I had an office that I had my own recording studio in, and it was a lot of fun. But then I took another job with an Apple specialist in Chicago, and Apple basically said, you can't do OWC Radio. And that was in 2010. So I retired from OWC Radio, and I went to work for an Apple specialist called Mac Specialist in Chicago, where I was for 3.5, almost 4 years. And then at the end of 2013, the owner of Mac Specialist came down with cancer. So obviously his focus shifted from running a business. Technically I ran the business, but from being a business owner to not dying. And so the business really couldn't survive that transition. So that business went out of business. And I was about to take another job with another company when I approached Larry and I said, hey, what do you think about starting up OWC Radio again? He was for it, so we started that podcast back up again. This time I didn't retire from the show I was doing, which was TechFan. I told him, I'm going to continue doing TechFan. And we fired up the show again, and right before I took this other job, he came to me, and they offered me a job of actually coming to work for OWC, and I accepted, and that's kind of where we are now. I'm an employee. I still do OWC Radio. And I traveled the country for trade shows for them.
And an OWC Radio 2.0, if you will, I think you used that term once. It was where I'm borrowing it from. What's the show like now? And maybe in comparison to where its first installment?
I did a lot less interviews the first time around. It was definitely more of a tech show where I was talking about the news of the day of whatever was going on in technology. But honestly, I think that gets kind of boring, and it really dates each episode. It's hard to go back and listen to a tech show when they're talking about news of the day and it's 3 years later. People don't want to listen to, what your thoughts of the iPhone 4S is.
Right.
It's like, that's so old, who cares? So I thought, let's shift the focus. We'll have one segment where I talk about kind of what's going on today and a product from OWC or a service. And then the second half, the much larger part of the show, is interviewing people that I find interesting. And it could be anyone from a documentary filmmaker, a musician, a producer, a writer on a tech website, another podcaster, just very interesting people that use technology in their lives. And, there's no real formula. I don't send them a list of questions ahead of time. I try not to even call it an interview. I try to call it a conversation because I want to talk to these people and get to know them. And through me, the listener gets to know them as well. And it's so much fun doing that. It's so much better for me, in my interest level, to have that conversation than just sitting in front of a microphone by myself talking about, oh, look, Apple just stopped giving away a free song a week on iTunes. That's an okay conversation if you're having it with other people like I do on TechFan. But when you're by yourself, it's just not that interesting, I don't think.
It's kind of tough to have a conversation or have a debate with yourself.
It is, unless you're really good at voices.
Yes.
Then it's just weird.
So we've talked about TechFan and OWC Radio, but that is not the extent of your involvement in the podcasting world. In fact, you are, in addition to mymac.com, we mentioned that website, but you are also the proprietor of a podcast network, the Stoplight Network. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, that started life as the MyMac Podcasting Network. And when we had just a few tech-related, Mac-related shows, and I kind of wanted to put them all under one banner. It didn't really work because I had other podcasters that had non-tech shows that were interested in being in the network, and I thought, the MyMac name doesn't work. So we changed the name to the Stoplight Network, completely arbitrary. There was no real reason behind the name. It just sounded different and kind of cool. The idea behind the network was a podcaster, if they're brand new, they don't know how to get up and running, we can help them. We can even create the website for them. We can get it submitted to iTunes for them. We can do their RSS feed for them. We can do anything that needs to be done for somebody that just wants to sit in front of a microphone, hit record, and export the MP3 or the enhanced podcast, whatever the case may be. They just don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of it. They're not a tech person. They're a radio type of personality. So we can help with that. Or if you already have a show, and this is really the reason behind the network, is we can help promote your show. And by that, each show in the network has to play one ad, at least one ad for another show in the network. You don't have to play any advertising, but you do have to promote another podcast in the network because they're going to do the same for you. So most of the podcasters, and we're all super lax on updating these, but we usually record a 30-second ad. We share them in Dropbox. And if you're recording your show, you just drag one of those ads into your show and you're done. That's the only really requirement that we ask of the other podcasters is, hey, promote these shows over here because they're going to promote you. So you start building up your listeners. You're helping other shows build up their listeners. And if you have any technical questions, we have a mailing list. There's a whole bunch of podcasters in it now that somebody probably knows the answer to.
And what are some of the shows on that network if people are looking to find some new stuff?
Well, we have TechFan, obviously, and that is me, David Cohen, and we just added Owen Rubin as a regular co-host. Owen he's got a very rich history in tech. He worked for Apple. He worked for Atari back in the 80s. He's a great guy. And we kind of wanted to expand the show because with me traveling a lot, I didn't want David to have to do a show by himself. So now we have 3 co-hosts. So we have TechFan. We have the MyMac podcast, which was the original show that I did. Guy and Gaz do that one. We have the 3 Geeky Ladies. I don't think there's enough women in podcasting, to be honest. So I love hosting a show from these 3 ladies that really are tech heads. I mean, they're very geeky, and the stuff they talk about, I have a passion about the same thing. So it's fun to talk to them when I'm on their show occasionally, but better, I love listening to it. Club Xbox, which is a gaming podcast. We do have one feed that any show on the network, if you subscribe to that, you get all the shows in iTunes. We have Let's Talk Apple. That's a monthly show. We also have Let's Talk Photography, which is obvious what that's about. Club Nintendo, which is about Nintendo gaming. Technically, OWC Radio isn't in the network, although I do have a banner up there, but that's just because I own the network, so I put a banner up there. The Deeper Look podcast, which is a podcast about stories and storytellers. That one's kind of hard to describe to someone who's never listened to podcasts. It's about nothing. It's kind of like Jerry Seinfeld. It's a podcast about nothing. It's just whatever the stories happen to be that they're discussing. Sometimes they have guests, sometimes they don't. Mac Guest is another Mac podcast. Club PlayStation, Club Film, Club Steam, and Club Apple. And that pretty much rounds them out. We did have another one called Your Victory Garden, but that one just went under.
Gotcha. And if somebody wants to find any of these shows, what's the best place for them to start?
Smoke Signals. You have to use a big towel and get a big raging fire, or they could just go to the stoplightnetwork.com.
Well, that would have been my guess. Smoke Signals.
Probably the easiest.
Gotcha. With this kind of involvement in podcasting, Tim, one of the things that I've not really asked anyone about, but I think that you're probably the best person to ask about, if somebody out there is thinking about getting into podcasting, we talked about that technical side. What are some of your recommendations for hardware, software? How would somebody in your recommendation get started with this?
Well, the biggest thing that you're going to want to spend money on is a microphone. Too many people buy a $25 USB mic and they call it good, and they can't figure out why they're not making the audio quality of their podcast any better than what they are. And it's always about the microphone. So find a really good microphone and stick with it. Microphone technology really hasn't changed a whole lot in the last 20 years. Yes, we have the USB mics now, but the technology of the microphone itself really hasn't changed. So what I did, I went with a XLR microphone. That's one of the big plugs that you see performers use on stage. Radio people, that's what they use. I mean, all the professional quality microphones are all XLR. And you have to power a microphone that has an XLR input. And to do that, I use an old piece of technology that I bought like 8 years ago called a Mobile Pre-USB from M Audio. And what that does is it connects to my computer, in this case a Mac, obviously. It connects to the Mac via USB. That's where it gets its power, and that's also how it powers the microphone. So I go from my microphone to the M Audio USB, and then from there it goes into my computer via USB. Now, but that's only my microphone. So I also want to record the other end of the conversations with people like you and I are talking right now. You use software to record my end of the conversation. You pull the audio directly from audio coming into your Mac, correct?
Yes.
So I was doing that at first, but I wanted to be able to adjust it dynamically as the recording is happening. So what I did was I bought a very cheap Y splitter, microphone splitter, that I plug into the audio output of my Mac. Usually that's where you'd put your headphones. So effectively I'm splitting up my audio that my Mac's making. One's going to a pair of headphones so I can actually hear you talking right now. The other output is going back into the second channel of the mobile pre-USB. So now I've got two audio inputs going into the audio USB. I use GarageBand to actually record the podcast, and because it's two channels on the mobile pre-USB, GarageBand sees two channels. So one channel is me on my microphone. The second channel is any audio that's coming out of my Macintosh, in this case, the Skype conversation with you or David, whoever I'm talking to, on the second channel. So I can dynamically see where their volume level is right in GarageBand. I can adjust it. I can put compression on it if I want to. I can back it off if they're way too hot. And you could really get a little bit more control over the audio quality. Now, the drawback is if I'm talking to more than one person, I can only adjust their volume together. I can't break out two separate conversations at the same time. It's just one audio feed.
And there really are a lot of ways of doing this. You know, there are so many. I've actually, one of the reasons I wanted to broach the subject with you, Tim, was I've actually had the first person now reach out to me, actually on the Facebook page for the Podcast Digest, and ask me about how I got started. And so now I'm finding myself in that advice input, kind of phase, and I don't want to steer somebody sideways at this point. I know how I've done it, but even my setup is a little bit different than what you've described. So there's definitely a lot of different ways that I think folks can go about accomplishing this.
Yeah, there's no, like I said earlier, there's no one way of doing things. Whatever works for you. If you're more of a software guy, probably the way you're doing it would make more sense, and it'd be more intuitive, and it'd be easy to troubleshoot. I'm more of a hardware guy by heart. So for me, it's a physical box that I can look at that I can adjust as I need to. There's actual cables running from here to there and back over to here and scooting behind my desk that way. To me, that makes sense, and I feel like I have more control of it that way. But people are all different. I mean, you're either a hardware or a software guy.
Well, I think one of the most important things for folks to know, especially if you want to start bringing on guests, is that if they're going to be in person, go XLR with the microphone. I learned that lesson the hard way. I bought the USB mic first. And then the most important thing, whether you use Tim's method or what I use, which is Ecamm software call recorder for Skype, Call Recorder does something similar, is that it does come out in those two channels. So there is my, track in as well as the guest track, and that's extraordinarily important. I've used other tools. My episode last week with S. Anthony Thomas, we did that via Hangouts, and I put a bumper on, if you've heard that episode already, about the sound quality. I mentioned that at first because it comes out as a single channel. So if you have people talking over each other or background noise from one side or the other, you can't really cut it out if the conversation is happening at the same time. So
yep.
Whether you're using Tim's hardware solution or the software that I've described, as long as you can get single track recordings for each speaker, I think that you're winning already.
The other aspect of that is when I originally set my rig up this way, the reason I like this even better than the method you were using, and I tried your method, the computers are much more stable now. They have much more RAM and much bigger hard drives. I didn't want to run any more programs at the time than I had to because GarageBand was very flaky. Skype was very flaky. It still is. But it's still better than it used to be. So I wanted really the Mac to just be recording and just be playing the audio through Skype, and that was it. I didn't want any other thing potentially that could crash. And it just works for me, really. But that's the home. I do a lot of recordings, like when I was at CES last 2 weeks ago, and I did recordings live at CES. Well, I can't take all this gear with me, so I have a pretty nice Sennheiser XLR microphone. I plugged that into this weird little contraption that I have no idea where I got it. It was off of some guy's website that's long since been gone. I plugged the XLR into this XLR adapter and this little cord. On one side is the XLR, the other side is a headphone jack. And I actually can power that XLR microphone through my iPhone and that cable. And then it also splits so I can actually plug in headphones as well. So I use an XLR microphone on my iPhone to actually record on the road, and it sounds a lot better.
Yeah, and that's a whole nother level, right, that you talked about. You know, when you start to go to on-site interviews or on the road, you mentioned at CES, that's a completely different setup and a different set of challenges as somebody's looking to try to break into that area as well.
Yeah, I use a program called Dropvox, VOX. It's a very super simple interface on the iPhone. It has a record button. But before you actually start using it, you set it up and you tie it to your Dropbox account. So I record the conversations live in person using this app. And as soon as I stop recording, it uploads that MP3 file to my Dropbox. So I'm not actually storing any of the content on my iPhone.
That's perfect.
So it's backing up to the cloud. It's backed up immediately. When I get home, I open my computer, Dropbox syncs within seconds, and boom, there's all my files.
That's beautiful. That is definitely something handy to have. I love Dropbox.
And it was like a 99-cent app, Dropvox, VOX.
Gotcha. I want to go back to the statement you made there. The first thing that you would need is that microphone. Do you have a recommendation, maybe an entry level, and for something that's somebody more advanced? Do you have items you back there?
Yeah, I use the M Audio microphones in the studio here itself, which is just my office at home. And they're like 8 years old. I'm sure there are better M Audio quality microphones out there nowadays. But when I bought this original kit, it came with 2 microphones. The other one's still brand new. I barely used it. So I don't know what else is out there now. I haven't really been shopping. Anytime I go and look at new microphones, if I'm at Guitar Center or something like that, I'm not seeing anything that I think is going to significantly give me a better dynamic sound than what I'm using right now, so I don't bother. But M Audio is really good. Sennheiser, I've always liked their mics. Those would be the 2 that I highly recommend.
Right. And on the USB side, I know I started out with the Blue Yeti, which I loved in terms of the sound, but it just came with those restrictions of the USB only.
Yeah, a lot of people that I talk to use the Blue microphones. If you're going to have a very simple podcast and that it's just basically you sitting in front of your computer recording, it's going to work fine. You're not going to need anything more than that. But if you want any kind of portability, if you want to be able to split tracks via hardware, that's just not the microphone you can use.
Exactly, and that's been one of the few sort of strong recommendations I've had for folks that, who are starting out. If you want to go anything beyond a you-only solo show, don't go USB, go XLR.
Yep.
Yep, indeed.
And you got a lot more choices, too. There's so many XLR microphones out there.
Exactly. What's funny is that after I made the investment in the Blue Yeti, and then I got a mixer. It was actually a birthday gift from my brother. He gave me a mixer. He's like, so now you can start doing other things. And I'm thinking to myself, yes, except my USB mic isn't going to work with this. I had to go out, and I wanted to do something that wasn't exorbitantly expensive. And one company that I've had, I would say, mixed results with, but more wins than losses, is Monoprice. And I went on Monoprice's site, and they sold the mic I'm using now, which is, their large condenser XLR mic, for like $80. And I was like, I'll give it a shot. Worst comes to worst, I can record it. And I was really concerned about the sound quality because I was very happy with what the Blue Yeti was giving me. And in the end, there was almost no difference. At least anything that I could hear on the back end and what I was actually putting out there sounded pretty similar.
Well, for the same price point, you can get a much better XLR mic than you can get a USB mic. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing to consider. But of course, there's other things that you want to look at. If you are doing predominantly in the studio, you want to get your mic up off the table. I'm hitting my table right now, and you can hear it, but it's not vibrating my entire mic. And that's because, like you, I'm using a swing arm to hold my microphone.
Yep.
And it gets it up off the desk. You can position it wherever you want dynamically as you're talking, so you're not blocking your screen the whole time. But you got to get the microphones up off the desk because you don't want to talk down at a mic. You actually want to talk either straight or up at the mic.
Yep. And that's one of the other things, too. If somebody really wants to get into podcasting, I think for me, this is one of those questions you really need to ask yourself. Is this something you're just trying and there's a chance you may go away from it? Or is this something you know that you are committed to, that you have a long tail to your show and that you are going to keep going forward? Because if you are, you can save yourself a lot of money in a lot of the areas Tim and I are talking about. Just on that ARM mention that you had just said there, I've been doing this is episode 23. I've been doing this since September of last year, and I'm on my third microphone prop, if you will. I started with a speaker stand or a microphone stand, if you will, with a boom arm. That got hairy. I couldn't get it right where I wanted to. I wanted an arm, but didn't want to spend boatloads of money on it. So on Amazon, I got a $15 thing that, looking at it now, was just a ridiculous way. It tore up the side of the desk, and there was nothing good about it. So for Christmas, actually, this is what I ended up with. I now have the Rode arm, which is
good. Yeah, that's a good one.
Which is pricey when you put in microphone arm into Amazon. It's near the top of the price point list, but like so many other things, you get what you pay for, and this thing has been phenomenal for me.
I've got a Heil, but I've had it for a number of years now, and the springs are starting to wear out on it. So I'm thinking about, within probably the next 6 to 8 months, I'm going to need to replace this. It's just the way it is. And pop filters are something else that are very inexpensive. Hardly anybody in podcasting uses them, but you really should use a pop filter.
And it's funny, I've got it, because you brought that up, I have to just mention this as well. That's another thing where I've kind of gone through iterations. I have the off phonics, the standard pop filter that everyone would normally talk about, with the big disc on the end and the arm that would clamp around. Just last week, actually came on Friday, is what I'm using today. And this thing is crazy. This is from Wind Tech. It's called Pop Guard. And I'm thinking to myself, why aren't all pop filters designed like this? It actually has 2 elastic bands on the back of it, and you literally just take this pop filter, this windshield, and slide it right over the capsule of your microphone, and it stays there perfectly.
Yep, and it looks good too.
Yeah, and it's one of those ones where I was like, wow, why isn't everything being designed this way? So I was going to put a little blog post on there for anybody interested in terms of the pop filter question. I love this new toy.
I'd like to see that in person myself, because I am using the big round.
Yep.
And I hate it. It gets in the way. It gets full of dust. I'm blowing it out all the time. It's not fun. But, you said something that's very relevant to potential podcasters. There's 2 different people that are into podcasting. Those who are going to give it a try, find out after the 7th or 8th episode that, you know what, I'm not famous. A whole bunch of people aren't listening to my show. It's taking a lot more effort than I thought it was going to. I'm just not going to do it anymore. Or, and we call that pod fade. They start out strong and they just kind of fade away. Or it's the second type of person. I think you're probably like this. I know I am. You think about the podcasting when you're not podcasting. You're in your car driving home from work, and you've got this idea of something that you want to talk about on the show, and you're looking for a place to pull over so you can write a quick note. You're thinking of, I wonder what kind of equipment that I could really get that's going to make my voice sound better. I wonder what kind of software that I can get so I could drop in little bumpers as the show is actually playing. How can I, change the way that my co-hosts sound so they sound better? Should I just have them recorded on their end, and then they can send me their audio file? That way I'm not recording a Skype conversation that's been compressed. It'll sound a lot better. You can't stop thinking about it. When you're not podcasting, you still are podcasting in your mind. And there's just not enough hours in the week for you to get enough of it done because you're so passionate about it. Those are the 2 kinds of people that get into podcasting. You fade out pretty quickly, or you stick with it, and you don't even think about how many people are listening. It's almost immaterial. It's the act of sitting there in front of the mic, having a conversation with someone, or just retelling stories, or talking about the latest in political news or technology or whatever the show is about. Gardening, like I said, we just had a guy that stopped podcasting because his time was too limited, and podcasting was the one thing he was had the least amount of passion for. So he stopped the podcasting. He asked me, what should I do? And I said, if you're not passionate about it, why are you spending your time doing it? And he said, yeah, you know what? I'm not passionate about it. So he's not podcasting anymore.
I totally agree with you. And I would like to consider myself in that second person that you've described there. One of the best things that I think anyone could understand fully. And when I heard this, I mentioned earlier, I listened to several podcasts about podcasts, and I don't do that necessarily because I'm overjoyed with the show itself from an entertainment standpoint, but rather I feel like if you really want to become better at something, you're going to research, you're going to listen, you're going to read and study, if you will, and that's what I tried to do. And on one of those shows, and I would cite it if I could recall where it came from, but I thought this was wonderful advice. Most people who have started a podcast would not consider, say, putting out an episode and over the course of a week, let's say, receiving 100 downloads. Most people wouldn't necessarily consider that to be a spectacular number. But ask yourself this question. If you were booked in a conference room at a hotel every Saturday at noon, you were going to go speak. And every Saturday at noon, 100 people showed up in that room to sit there and listen to you speak. Would you consider that something you'd be happy with? Would you feel proud? Would you feel as if you're making a contribution or that people are getting value out of what you're doing? And I think when you look at it that way, having 100 people regularly want to hear what you're doing is pretty phenomenal when you put it in the physical world.
That's a fantastic analogy.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm sort of a numbers guy. I love checking the stats, but I do so not because there's a particular threshold I'm looking for, but rather sort of to feed that other side that you were describing, Tim, which is, wow, there's this many more people. This is amazing. So then I shift towards what can I do better? What can I bring on next? Who can I talk to next from a software hardware standpoint? You mentioned the idea you're podcasting when you're not. A few episodes back, I believe it was episode 17, I did it the day before New Year's Eve. I did a top 10 episodes of 2014. And on the night of the 29th, the night before, I had trouble falling asleep. And I woke up the next morning, and my wife was like, "What? You were all shifting around. What was the problem?" And I said, "I've got to record today. There's something I want to do." Because the idea of doing that top 10 episode, and we talked about, the flexibility of XLR. I've got a mixer here. I had my iPad hooked to my mixer and had queued up 10 episodes from some of my favorite podcasts, and I basically DJ'd, if you will, live played clips through the mixer to put out that top 10 show. And I was thinking about it for like 2 hours the night before, how I would put this together, what shows I wanted to recommend, what clips I wanted to play. And so I know that itch. And if you're that person out there, this is something that you'll probably love doing.
You're talking about the numbers and stuff. What happens, and again, I've been podcasting for 11 years now, so technically, pretty much since podcasting started, I've been doing this. I was obsessed with numbers for the first few years. And if you try to get advertising, which is a whole nother topic, if you try to get advertising, the advertisers themselves want to know what kind of numbers they're looking at. Even though numbers are virtually impossible to actually give. For instance, Apple says, we don't cache your files. We pull them directly from your server. So if your server goes down, then someone could not download that episode in iTunes, right? Well, I've literally taken my episodes down before. I was rebooting my website. And I don't know, somehow I was still able to download podcasts from iTunes. So Apple's lied a few times. And there's other services like Stitcher that will occasionally cache your files on their servers and serve them. So you can't really give accurate numbers. We don't know. We also don't know how long people listen to it. Did they only listen to this segment, but they don't listen to this one? I was obsessed with numbers for the first few years. I could care less nowadays. I really could. I don't care how many people there are listening. I just know there are people that are listening. And I'm more interested in hearing from the people that are listening rather than the numbers themselves, because the numbers really don't mean anything. It's too arbitrary nowadays. I like to know that there are actual people listening. That's the only thing I really care about. They're listening, they're interacting, and they're getting enjoyment out of it. That's all I care about.
And that's something I've talked about before as well. I think one of my earlier episodes, I did a whole section on feedback, because until I had my own show, I never fully appreciated or understood the value in the feedback that a podcast host would receive. Whether it be conversational on a topic that you've asked for, or just a quick shout out on Twitter. Great show, guys. Keep up the good work. Something like that. It is amazingly valuable, and it's been a constant theme through all the podcast hosts I've been speaking to, as well as what I've seen myself. So, and I know you guys are asking for it on TechFan very often, and that is a huge deal. It is more important than the numbers.
And we never did before. It was very rare that I actually asked for feedback. Just the last episode that we did, I think it was called The Case. Is that what it was called?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah, episode 194, The Case. The episode before, a longtime listener, Neil Wharton, asked, hey, could you ask your listeners, do they use cases for their iPhone or smartphone? And if so, which one? I had 6 pages of response from Facebook and Twitter on that. It was amazing. It blew me away, to be honest. And who knew that it would be a very simple question like that would provoke that much feedback? But when you get it, oh, it's so rewarding. It's more rewarding than if someone, say, sent you a check for $100 to advertise on this episode, right?
Right.
You'd much rather have the feedback. Don't get me wrong, we could all use some scratch, but, rewarding, personally rewarding, when someone sends you feedback saying, hey, I listened to the show, thanks for recording it. If they send you a feedback saying, you were totally wrong about this, I can't believe how stupid you are to say that, how dare you? You know what? You still like that feedback too. Why? Because it's feedback. They're listening. It's great.
Absolutely, and that's one of those things that I've talked about with some of these podcasts as well, is that if it moves you, and what I mean by that is that while you're listening to it, as soon as you're done listening to it, you are now prompted to do something, whether it be pull out that product that you've talked about on OWC or on Amazon or whatever the case may be, or to go see that movie, or to go check out that product, or to look at that that conference or that story, or to provide feedback, send an email, a shout out on Twitter. When a podcast does that to you, that means you're an engaged listener, and that's really where it starts to become fun as a host.
Well, that's the other aspect of podcasting that I never want people to misconstrue. I'm not just a podcaster. I'm a listener. I listen to a lot of different podcasts. It's my favorite thing. That's why I'm so passionate about it. I encourage people. There's an ad that other podcasters play in the Stoplight Network about me trying to help other people get into podcasting. And it's for selfish reasons, because I want to hear other new shows myself. I want to experience a podcast that I've never listened to and get hooked on it. To me, that's fantastic. It's so much better than watching movies or television shows. I do both of those things. But when I'm by myself, I'm driving in the car, or I'm on an airline, I'm flying to LA or something, sitting there with a pair of headphones on, listening to a really good podcast, nothing's better than that to me.
I couldn't agree with you more. I couldn't agree with you more. And my wife and family will tell you the same, as I'm almost always with headphones in for one reason or another.
And your kids will hate the shows that you listen to.
They've actually started to listen to this one now, which is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it won't last long, trust me.
I think with one of them, it's faded out.
Well, my wife listened to it at first, but now she could care less. She's like, I can talk to you and hear you anytime I want it, so I don't need to. Yeah.
My wife doesn't really listen either.
No, don't ever expect her to, and don't ask her to. That's a big one for other podcasters. Don't ask your spouse to listen to your podcast. You may be passionate about it. You may think it's the best thing since sliced bread, which is a weird analogy when you think about it. They don't care. And you know what? It's probably best that they don't listen to it, because you really don't want their opinion about it. You don't.
Right.
Just do it because you're passionate about it. He or she is going to be very supportive and letting you do it. But don't ask them to join in. Don't ask them to listen unless they volunteer.
Exactly. Yeah. I've had a couple of people ask me if my wife will ever come on with me, and I put out an early standing invitation, and should she ever choose or have a desire, great. And if she doesn't, that's great too.
11 years, I've been on the show, I think, one time. I coached her one time, and that was from another room. She was answering. That was it. She has no desire to be on there at all.
Well, let's go into my last question I've got for you, Tim. Let's talk about the future of any of your current shows, or Stoplight Network, mymac.com. If somebody's jumping on the bandwagon today, what would they have to look forward to?
Pretty much more of the same. I mean, with OWC Radio, obviously it's my day job. I started that podcast before I was an employee, and it really didn't change when I became an employee. It's not a show based around one product or even one company. It's just a regular show with exciting guests, I think so anyways, and with one sponsor. So if you look at it that way, it's just like any other show. TechFan, we're always looking to do new and different things. We're really starting to concentrate on talking about specific products now. And for instance, I just did a quasi review of a Chromebook, a couple different Kindles, some Bluetooth headphones and speakers. So we're looking at more product specific on that show, and we kind of want to start moving in that direction. We're still going to have the conversational stuff, but probably twice a month, so every other episode, we kind of want to have a focus on a product. I've got so many contacts with so many companies. I could pretty much get almost any product I want for review. You got to send it back when you're done, but why not get some of these products and play with it and then talk about it on TechFan, and in such a way that if you're interested in that product, like a Chromebook, you're not going to hear just the opinion of the person who actually used it, their review, but the other people on the show and what their opinions are of it, whether they use it or not, what their questions are. So it's a really great conversation piece. It's, you focus on one thing and here's what's good, here's what's bad. They have questions, they haven't used it. So kind of looking at doing more of that with TechFan. The MyMac, I mean, we've doing product reviews since 1995. That's not going to change anytime soon. And the Stoplight Network, hopefully, will just continue to grow. New podcasts coming in. We are looking for an ad salesman for that network. It's been very hard to find someone that will approach advertisers, get them to advertise on the network, and some podcasters could potentially start making some money by putting some ads in their shows.
Well, that sounds great. That sounds like a lot of exciting stuff coming up. I know I've been listening to several of these shows for a long time. I plan on keep listening as well, and I hope the listeners here today will do the same. Mention it one more time for me, Tim. Where can people find all this show, all the information on MyMac, yourself? Where can they find you?
Well, Dan, the easiest way to find me is if you go up to Twitter, I'm at MyMac, MYMAC. I'm also on Facebook. I've got a public thing there, so it's not hidden behind privacy. I'm friends with people who listen to the podcast, old school friends, family. So Facebook is wide open and everything for me. MyMac.com is MyMac.com. I own it. I still contribute some reviews there, as long as it's kind of tricky because I work for OWC, so I can't really review things that compete with the products for the company that I work for because of the conflict of interest. But I edit everything that you see up there on the site. TechFan is at techfanpodcast.com. We've been doing that for a number of years now. It's funny that it still feels like the new show to David and I, because we did MyMac for so many years, and TechFan we started in 2010, and we're still going strong, but it still feels like a new show to us.
Well, I'm a huge fan of TechFan, no pun intended there. It's been on my subscription list for a long, long time. It's not going anywhere anytime soon. And thank you. Thank you very much, Tim, for joining me on this conversation today. Hopefully it's been informative for the listeners, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate you letting me come on and pitch my stuff.
Well, thank you again, folks, for taking the time to listen to the Podcast Digest, episode 23. Any feedback would be greatly appreciated. You can follow the show at Twitter at Pod Digest or on Facebook. Just search for the Podcast Digest, the website where you can find all the old episodes and a few exclusive blog entries, thepodcastdigest.info. Once again, my name is Dan Lizette. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you next week.